Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And for the first episode of 2026, we were on a little Christmas vacation since December 22nd, so I apologize for not publishing any episodes during that Christmas time. But we are back now, hopefully, for the regular schedule. And to kick off the new year, we're going to start a three-part series on the Third Reich. We might possibly do four episodes on this, depending on part three, because it's a lot to cover in the final years of the Third Reich. So we aren't entirely sure yet, but we will see when we get there. And of course, I'm joined by Norwegian historian Anders Dagros Kjøstvedt, and I hope I said that's right. And the butcher of my own local Norwegian name has written a Norwegian book that came out late last year, which is called Third Reich. I'm of course holding it up right here. And as always, of course, I'd like to do. What was it about this topic for you that felt you compelled to write this book?
Yes, first, thank you, Erlend, for inviting me to your podcast. I'm looking forward to our talks. And I could say that what it interested me is this is something that I have been working on for a very long time. I work now at a teacher education institution here in Norway. I train students that are going to be teachers in primary and lower secondary school. So I teach history and history didactics to them, including the history of the First and the Second World War and interwar period and the Holocaust and everything else. But my research interest goes further back. I did my PhD on the Nazi movement in Berlin in the 1920s. Back in 2009, I finished. So this is something that has I have been following for quite a lot of time.
Mm,
So I wanted to write a book about this in Norwegian um, that covers all the most important parts of the establishment of the Nazi movement and its rise to power, the Nazi regime, the Second World War, and the Holocaust. Because there's a lot of interest in this subject in Norway, but there are quite few or no books like this one that covers the entire
mm.
period that is written in Norwegian. Of course, some of the major works in English are translated into Norwegian, but I wanted also to write something on my own.
And of course, it's very relevant in 2026 as well, unfortunately. So I want to begin with the final loss of the First World War, or the Great War, as I prefer. I guess that's kind of a more academic term for the war, because it wasn't the First World War back then, of course. But let's begin with the news and the Treaty of Versailles and the troops turning home, and what the national feeling in Germany at
Mm.
the time, which is a lot of what will happen in the next 10 in the next decade depends on this moment of the defeat of Nazi Germany.
Yeah, I think it's
Sorry, no,
it's
sorry, not
difficult.
defeat of not Germany, but defeat of the the Prussian Empire and Wilhelm II, of course, not Nazi Germany.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to underestimate how important the war is for the birth of the German Republic, First Democratic Republic, and of course also the rise of Nazism. It's I think we have to begin with the ending of the war, and the of course we today agree that Germany lost the war, and quite significantly. They lost also militarily on the front, but that was not necessarily the impression that most people living in Germany at the time had in 1918. And I think this is crucial. And this is not limited to officers in the army or politicians or anybody else in the established elites. This is something that goes quite strongly through the German population in this last autumn of the war, that the war ended in some kind of a draw. It was not really a German defeat. They just decided to let's stop fighting.
Mm.
And there is an expectation among majority of Germans that the settlement after the war will include Germany in its discussions, and maybe preparation to pay some sort of compensation to the countries that have been part of the war, but not in the scale or in the way that was actually carried out at the Versailles negotiations that ended in the Versailles Treaty. So I think that's in order to understand how German history developed in the early 1920s, we have to take into account this lack of responsibility among political elites, but
Mm,
also economic, cultural elites in Germany to take this defeat seriously and actually
mm,
act upon it.
mm,
And that's why also I opened my book with the end of the war and the notion that it did not really end in defeat, but some let's just decide to stop fighting, and then we'll talk about how we shall
mm.
proceed from here.
Of course, a big part of it was Ludendorff's breakdown in 1918 as well. So, and it's interesting that both Hindenburg and Ludendorff, though they are mostly to blame for this, also would bite it back. And this will be a crucial red line for this book is the stab in the back myth that will be adapted by the Nazis in later on in the political campaign. So let's begin with where the stab in the back myth come from. And of course, and like I said, it's ironic because Ludendorff and Hindenburg are really the one to blame for losing the war. And they as well and realized that no, it was not our fault. It was the German people's fault. Even though we made an episode a while ago, right before Christmas, about the war, how Germany lost the war and it was even though the home front was starving they couldn't possibly be to blame for the defeat. It was equal bad on the home front as on the battlefield. So it's kind of funny that both Ludendorff and Hindenburg also buy into the myth of the stab in the back myth that would come out of the defeat in the war.
Yeah, and I think they see it as a way out from taking responsibility from the defeats, that you could place the blame on the civilian politicians that are introduced partially into power at the end of the war, and also then to place the blame on political opponents such as social democrats, communists, and of course also the Jewish population of Germany. So they become then very convenient scapegoats. And I think that if the stab in the back myth was only proposed and like propagated by right-wing extremists like Ludendorff, that would not be a huge problem. The main problem is that most Germans actually believe this. That
Mm.
is the main catastrophe, you could say.
If
If
I'm going to take it
only
one, sorry for interrupting you, but if I'm going to take this one step further, the stab in the back, I mean, it's kind of a stab in the back to those people on the home front that actually, like I said, was equally starved and equally suffered as well. So it kind of a stab in the back to those who were blamed to being stabbed in the back.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that we should look at this as the military leadership of Germany trying to place the blame on anybody else but themselves. And the major difficulty of the early democratic years of the German Republic is that quite the majority of the German people, including also the new president, the Social Democratic president, to a very large extent actually believes this myth that there was not necessarily the actual stab in the back legend, that it was a planned undermining from the left-wing political side, but that there was not really an actual defeat.
Mm.
And because this plays on in the years following, that the political elites of Germany doesn't really take responsibility for also the economic difficulties that they have moved Germany into by fighting the war, and they instead blame the economic consequences that are placed upon Germany from their former enemies like Germany and France, and then particularly through the repayment system. And they use this system of repayments that Germany have to do as an excuse for not really taking the economic difficulties Germany are in seriously, or they actually try to further them in order to show to the Allies that we are not able to pay the repayments.
And of course, a crucial factor in the Versailles Treaty that we will come to, that again is very important for the Nazi political campaign, is the reduction of the army. And of course, one man who got lucky and were not reducted in this treaty is, of course, a gentleman called Adolf Hitler. So let's give it a little background on Hitler before we go into the reduction of army and do a little brief history. And I plan to cover his life in detail much later on, of course. But let's start with a little brief history and how Hitler ended up in Germany in 1918.
Yes, he is an Austrian national. He is born in 1889 on the border town of Braunau am Inn on the border of Germany and Austria. This is probably quite well known. His father is a customs official in this town. I think that one very crucial thing about Hitler is that he comes from a quite modest background.
Mm,
He is not raised in poverty, we could say. It's his father is a rather well-off customs official in the Austrian bureaucracy. But he still is very much of an outsider when it comes to the political scene in Germany when he becomes a politician from the early 1920s. So for Hitler himself, this is in one side a huge asset because he can portray himself as a man of the people, someone that speaks with the voice of the common man. But it is also a huge
mm,
challenge because he does not have the social credentials or the social background that he will need in order to get access into the social and the economic circles that can open doors for him as an aspiring politician from a very, very small
mm,
political party. So Hitler himself has a very strange and quite problematic feeling about his childhood, his adolescence, and his
mm,
background, and it does a lot to try to hide it away.
mm,
There are quite a few personal passages in the book Mein Kampf when he writes about his childhood and adolescence. Most of them are completely false, and they are written in order to create some kind of legend or myth about his own
mm.
childhood. And he goes very far in order to erase all the traces of his own adolescence and childhood in western parts of
Mm.
Austria.
I think it was Richard J. Evans pointed this out that, and a more recent historian that said that Hitler claimed to have this terrible childhood, but it wasn't any more terrible than a normal Austrian child at the time. So his childhood wasn't that bad as most historians seem to think. It was kind of normal in compare if you compare to other children growing up. I mean,
Mm.
his father would beat him, but that again, that was normal for the time, and pretty much up until recently, that people would beat a child if they didn't misbehave. So he didn't have that terrible childhood as he claimed he has. It was normal.
Yes, his upbringing is quite normal considered the historical context that he grew up in. He never claims publicly, to my knowledge, that he had a difficult childhood. He would rather paint it as a quite not romanticize it perhaps, but to state quite clearly that his childhood was completely normal. There was nothing exceptional about it. It's more in after 1945 that we have discussed have his childhood actually had any influence on who he became as an
Mm.
adult. And but you are quite right that from what we know, because there is a lot of this that we actually do not know anything about, his childhood seems to be quite common. He was closely attached to
Mm.
his mother, but quite distant relationship to his father that was also quite old, but that's not uncommon in the late 19th century. What he wanted to keep to himself, or actually to keep away from the public life, was this origin story, who his grandparents were. There was some people asking questions about this, and of course there are were also genuine questions about his ancestry. So this is partly, as I said, an asset because he can use it to portray himself as an ordinary man, but it's also quite difficult when he tries to build a political career.
Mm. And
And to,
again,
yes,
sorry.
because and we need to understand this, I think, to see the person, the politician Hitler when he emerges in the early 1920s, because
Yeah.
he's totally dependent on people that can help him and give him access into political circles, social circles that are closed off to him. He doesn't have an education. His name literally means I am poor because it comes from the German name Hütte, meaning hut, and not like a hut you build in the forest when you are a Boy Scout or something, but it means like more. He comes from a tenant farmer background, so also his name spells out to everyone that he has comes from a lower social class. He speaks a
Mm.
dialect, at least, and he has never studied at a university. He has a military background as a volunteer in the First World War, but he has no education as an army officer. So he has really nothing to show for himself when he tries to become a politician. So, and that gives him a very strong disadvantage, especially on the right wing side of politics that are obsessed with names, background, and what kind of family you come from.
Mm. No, we have to discuss the elephant in the room, which is anti-Semitism. And again, when I recorded with Richard J. Evans a few years, I think it's 2 years ago now. The time flies, but we talked about how he wasn't really anti-Semitic until the after the war, and we can tell by this because a lot of clientele when he were in Vienna in the 1908 when he lived there for a few years, he'd relied on a lot of Jewish clientele for his artwork and when he painted postcards in Vienna. Like it is even speculated that one of his friends there were a Jew as well. So it's his anti-Semitism doesn't really show until the end of the war, as far as I'm aware, that modern politicians seem to agree. Sorry, not modern politicians, but modern historians seem to agree that his anti-Semitism didn't really occur until after the war.
Hmm. Yeah. But again, his own book, The Mein Kampf, has a very, very strong influence on how we have portrayed and understood Hitler also in the post 1945 era. And it has been taken more or less as a real account of his early years. And he writes quite specifically that during his stay in Vienna, he developed anti-Semitic ideas because, as he says himself, he was then confronted with the Jewish population of Vienna, which was quite extensive, and then he really discovered, as he says himself, the malign character of Jews and how they have a bad influence or a very, very destructive influence on the world itself. So there's quite a lot that actually, as you say, tells us that this is not true. He really doesn't express any anti-Semitic ideas that we have access to today in the years before the war. The first like real document that we can say for sure was written by Hitler that is very anti-Semitic in nature is a letter he wrote in 1919. So historians today have more or less concluded that this is something that he develops later in life, so that his story about becoming an anti-Semite in Vienna is false. But we shouldn't say that having a Jewish friend or a Jewish
Mm.
client is makes you impossible
No, no,
for you
no,
to
of
be an
course.
anti-Semite, because you can easily be both. And also during some of the trials after the war, such as the Eichmann trial, he also used to claim quite specifically that he had Jewish friends and he helped Jewish people, and probably he did. But he also sent hundreds of thousands, millions to the vets. So
Yeah,
so there's not a really something that goes against each other there. So,
a silver lining
but
there.
yes, so his it is quite probable that he would. Hitler was a quite an avid reader before the war. He spent a lot of his time reading newspapers, reading books. He would usually read about pan-Germanic literature, people that were arguing that the Germans should come together in one German state, not be separated into Germany and Austria and German minorities other places in Europe. And he would, of course, have been writing or reading anti-Semitic literature. That's quite reasonable to think. And he was then part of, you could say, uh, political thinking that was brushing up against anti-Semitism. So he would be familiar with this, and it was quite common in Germany, of course, at the time. But he does not himself express it, and it is likely that it is with the end of the First World War and the Versailles Treaty, which, of course, comes a bit later, which Hitler sees as a very also personal defeat to him
Mm.
and a betrayal of Germany and also a betrayal of him personally, and that he develops his anti-Semitic ideas from this moment.
Mm. So let's talk about how he comes to come across the NSDAP or National Socialistic Political Party. So because from my if I remember this correctly, he does get his task after the war was to spy on political parties such as Marxist and also minor political parties that could be a threat to Germany. So from my understanding, so let's talk about how he would end up and what was his impression because they weren't a big party back then. There were just a few bullies, to put it that way, that were founded the far right NSDAP, and it wasn't even called NSDAP back then, I think. So let's talk about how how we would at final end up meeting them.
Mm. Um, in 1914, Hitler volunteers for the war, and he ends up, and of course, he's then in Munich, so he ends up in the German army. He is, ironically, initially, he had fled his native Austria in order to avoid military service,
Because
and
he
does
didn't realize
so.
it's sorry for interrupting you, but yeah, he didn't see a point of doing military service when there were no wars, from my
Yeah,
remembrance.
and yes, and he was not too keen on fighting for the Austro-Hungarian empire. So, like Mussolini, his fascist dictator colleague, he runs away to a foreign country in order to escape from military service. That's quite ironic for two dictators that are so uh, feels that it's so important with military campaigns. But he enlists and he fights in the war for 4 years. And when the war is over, millions of Germans are demobilized, of course, from the armed forces. One of the very few that actually stays in the army is Hitler. And he does so because that's the only world that he is actually familiar with. He has nothing to return to. He doesn't have a job. He doesn't have any studies to return to. He doesn't have a family. His parents are already dead many years ago. So this is the only social milieu that he has any experience with and that he wants to remain in. So he does almost anything in order to remain in the army. And of course, he volunteered for the Bavarian army, not the Prussian army. So he goes back to Munich. And also, when Munich and Bavaria becomes a communist Soviet republic in 1919, Hitler stays on. So even if his superior is a communist Jewish person, he stays on in the armed forces because that's where he feels that he belongs. So when the communist rebellion in Munich and Bavaria is crushed, he also is able to remain in the armed forces, but this time, as you say, as a spy or as an agent that is operating in the political subcultures of Munich in order to find or infiltrate political parties that may be submissive against the state. And he's also what Hitler can bring to the armed forces is information about his former comrades, and also to tell the superior officers who of them were actually active as communists and communist infiltrators of the army. So he is a turncoat in the sense that he has been working with these people for months, and he informs about them to his new superiors in order to remain in the army. And then they employ him to go around to meeting halls and actually to spy on any party that can be a danger to the German state. So that's when he meets the Nazi party for the first time. He's there to spy on them, yes.
Hmm. So what is it that so intriguing to Hitler that made him join? And how does he begin to become a speaker for how does he end up being doing his first speech at the first Nazi Party rally that he, and maybe not the first, but eventually that he began to do speech for the, and this is one of the talents that he has. He now can captivate the audience in, so this is where he get his political talent from. So let's talk about how he ends up becoming doing his first speech for the Nazi Party. And again, of course, it would be called the Nazi Party later, but let's just call it the Nazi Party to simplify. But that, how does he end up becoming a speaker for the Nazi Party?
Yeah, what we have to be a bit careful here as well because there are, as with so many other aspects of this history, there are many myths and misconceptions, and that have some of them have been brewed together, you could say, by Hitler or the Nazis themselves. So a lot of the stories about how Hitler was first engaged with the Nazi Party and how he became a member of them are shrouded in a bit of mystery. And there are a lot of myths created about this. Supposedly that it was only seven members of the party, or that Hitler was the seventh member of the
Yeah.
party, which is quite amusing, but has turned into more or less of a legend that has been retold so many times that it quite a few people think this is still actually true.
Well, what
But
is the
what
actual
Hitler
number?
Actually, I can't remember at the moment, but there were about three, four, 500 members of of this specific party when he joined, or at least they had issued that amount of membership cards. But quite a few of them had also then left the party. So maybe about 250 members of this party when Hitler met them for the first time. So what he finds here is that he finds an expression of the political outlook that has been growing within himself. And he is very strongly opposed to the ending of the war, the German defeat, and how this has changed the political landscape of Germany. He sees the end of the empire and the establishment of the Democratic Republic and especially then of the Social Democratic Party, which is the major party in Germany in the early 1920s. He feels this is a major betrayal of the German people and of his war service personally. So what he finds in this party is some people that express more or less the same ideas that he has developed himself since the end of the war. And what he also finds is that he feels that these ideas are expressed quite poorly, that people that more or less agree on the hatred for the Versailles Treaty and hatred for the Democratic Republic, they bicker among themselves. And he writes himself, and this is probably true, but of course we are not totally sure, that he takes to he starts to question one of the speakers at this first meeting that he is present because he feels that his ideas are too conservative, that they are all bickering about small and insignificant things. So gradually, he thinks that he can himself actually play a part in this. And he must probably have had some experience of being maybe not a public speaker in his army days, but he gets his first role as some kind of Vertrauensmann in his army company. He's more like what you call it in English.
I don't speak German,
Uh,
so
yes, sorry.
I don't speak
No,
German, so I don't know.
he's more like a soldier's representative
Mm.
among his company. So he has gone to some meeting and maybe he has some experience speaking there, but not really publicly and not very much about political issues. So he discovers quite rapidly that he has some kind of talent in order to make people listen to him and to bring his ideas that are not particularly original, but he has a way of speaking that at least some people have an interest in actually listening to.
Mm. So let's talk about how he built up his, and I think Hitler as well is how does it gain popularity in this and become kind of the leader of the Nazi Party and his rise in political power? And I also want to add from my understanding, Hitler says that, politics was kind of a means to an end. If he didn't have any other choice, he wouldn't go into politics. I don't know if that was just, him saying some bullshit there, but I think from my well, if I remember correctly, he mentions one time that politics was just a mean to an end thing, but he clearly had talent for speech, and people again something that comes up again and again when people talk about him is the eyes that were so captivating about him when he spoke and how he's famous as you can see on videos when he uses the arms when he speak and how it can be captivate you just when you're meeting you, the dazzling of. So let's talk about his rise in political power and what was so
Mm.
intriguing about when he spoke. And again, the eyes is kind of an important factor, as silly as it may be, because a lot of people describe this when meeting him.
Yes, what we have to remember is that Hitler also develops as a political speaker throughout the years. So much of what we um, attribute to him, like his physical acts on a podium, is also quite a lot of it is something that he develops later. And he is quite we should consider him as a very modern politician in the sense that he's very concerned about how he is viewed by others. How do I appear now? And that's why he spends a lot of time rehearsing being a public speaker because he's very concerned about how do I appear? How do other people view me if I do this or if I do that? But it's quite clear that he has some kind of inert or like personal charisma that makes him into a good speaker that people actually want to listen to. And he enters the political stage in Munich, in Bavaria, and this is important because Bavaria is, because Germany at the time, as it is now, is a federal republic with more not independent states, but you have states that have a huge internal power. And of course, Bavaria is one of them. So politics in Bavaria is not the same as it in other parts of Germany, like in Prussia or in Berlin. And Munich and Bavaria is, you could say, a stronghold for anti-republican, anti-democratic, and also, of course, anti-Semitic, very strongly nationalistic forces. The main politicians also running the state of Bavaria at the time are quite opposed to the Weimar Republic and are very very critical of it and would like to remove it for maybe going back to the empire or at least the military dictatorship. So there is, you could say, a fertile ground for the ideas that Hitler is propagating at the time: nationalism, end of Versailles, anti-Semitism. The Jews are to blame.
Mm.
But of course, it's also very, very difficult because what then becomes the National Socialist Party has a lot of competition. And there are several parties that are trying to do exactly more or less the same. And the NSDAP is one of the smallest and most insignificant of these parties. So the first thing they have to do is to try to actually gain some foothold within their
Mm.
own subcontext of anti-democratic, anti-republican right. And this actually takes some time, but one of the things that makes the Nazi Party apart from the others is Hitler's ability to speak.
Mm.
Many of these parties are portrayed as quite conservative, more debating clubs that talk a lot. But what makes the Nazi Party different is that they are more activist oriented. They have more public appearances, and they are able to draw larger crowds to their meetings because many people want to come to watch and listen to Hitler. Not necessarily always because they are totally in agreement with what he has to say, but also because he, after a few years, becomes more or less of a celebrity, at least within Munich or within certain political circles. And this makes the NSDAP more able to attract people to their public events, giving them more gate receipts so they can also invest in developing the party organization.
Mm. Now, I want to take a moment and talk about some other key figures in Hitler's career, and of course, that is some of the men in his inner circle. And of course, I want to talk about how Joseph Goebbels and Hermann Göring and Himmler would come into the National Socialist Party. And of course, it's interesting. I think John Toland, the historian, would write that Goebbels was actually a communist before he wasn't a communist, but he played with communism before he went into the far right. So let's talk a little bit about how some of these people would enter and become such a key player to the rise of the Nazi Party, especially Goebbels, of course, being a journalist and being familiar, having lied from the very beginning of his career. So it's not an unfamiliar game to him. So how he became the propaganda minister for the Third Reich. And I think he plays a crucial part in what made the Nazi Party so popular.
Yes, Goebbels is an important part of the rise of the Nazi Party, but at a later date, when we are talking about the early 1920s, what is very important to stress is that Hitler is not alone. We began discussing this and introducing Hitler very, very early, and he is, of course, totally crucial to this story. It's difficult to see the rise of the Nazi movement in Germany without Hitler. But doing so, placing so much focus on one individual makes it also the danger here is that we place too much emphasis on
Yeah.
certain individuals. And as we discussed briefly in the beginning, giving Hitler's modest social background, he is dependent on people that can open doors for him. And in Munich and Bavaria in the early 1920s, one of these persons are Hermann Göring, as you mentioned, because he has a much
Mm.
higher social standing. He comes from a very rich and influential family. But
And
there
he
are
was
also
also a
other great.
hero. He was also a hero from the First World War as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And there are other persons like Dietrich Eckart, Karl May, that also sends Hitler to the first meeting of the Nazi Party, and but maybe most importantly, Ernst Röhm,
Yeah.
the later leader of the SA, the Brown Shirts, captain in the armed forces, has very good connections within the Reichswehr or the armed forces in Germany in the Weimar Republic. He provides the Nazi movement with equipment, and he provides it with information and connections to other officers in the army that are crucial to gain support among the hierarchy of the social elites. So a person like Goebbels is important, but he shows up a bit later. But these persons are important because also because they are financial contributors to the early Nazi movements. They acquire a newspaper that's called the Völkische Beobachter, the major NSDAP newspaper that is bought by funds that Hitler, of course, doesn't have. And the Nazi Party itself doesn't have it. That's privately funded by supporters of the Nazi Party. So these persons are extremely important in bringing Hitler into the circles where he can meet peoples that
Mm.
can support him financially, because he would not be able to be or command such a high level of activism within the Nazi movement that they actually are without this financial support.
Mm. And something that we should feel we also should bring up is that Ernström was also a gay man in the 1920s, or it was his entire life, but which is also fascinating that, it wasn't a big deal for Hitler until it became politically relevant. So as we will see in next part where we talk about the Night of the Long Knives, but Ernst Röhm, a lot of people in the SA as well were gay, and they would go to these gay bars and gay nightclubs in Weimar, Germany, which was surprisingly tolerant to homosexuality at the time. Just so it's interesting that Hitler didn't really care about Rome's sexuality up until it became politically relevant.
Yes, or up until the point where Hitler was more important to Röhm than Röhm was to Hitler.
Yeah,
Uh, as I said, that Hitler is totally dependent on working with these people. He does not have the luxury of picking who can help him based on their sexual preferences. He doesn't care about what Ernst Röhm does in his bed. He cares about how he can help him. And Röhm is the one helping Hitler, not the other way around. So Hitler can't really, at least in the 1920s, question a person like Ernst Röhm because he's dependent on his help. So I think that's a part of this story that we have to remember. It's only
yeah,
in after 1933, after discussions with Heinrich Himmler, where there is a decision that they should move, you could say, the initiative in the power struggle within the Nazi Germany towards the SS rather than the SA. That the homosexuality of Röhm and some of his close associates becomes a problem,
yeah.
and that's something that they more or less use as an excuse to not only kick these people out of the Nazi movement, but also to imprison and to murder some of them in 1934. So when Röhm is an important political and also military asset to Hitler and other people in the Nazi movement, they don't care about his sexual preference at all, but they use it in order to get rid of him later.
Hmm. So I want to take one moment to shy away from Germany for a second because we have to go. One crucial factor that happened in Italy is, of course, Mussolini and his march on Rome that will inspire Hitler a few years on. So we have to mention this as well. So let's talk briefly about Mussolini's march on Rome that will later inspire Hitler to do the famous Beer Hall Putsch.
Mm. Yeah. And again, we are talking about things that are shrouded in legend and myth making. Um, Mussolini didn't march on Rome.
Yeah.
He took the train. And this is symbolically, you could say it's a march on power. It's styled and symbolized like Italian fascist movement gathering around from all corners of the country, marching on the decadent politicians of the capital. So it is portrayed as some kind of a revolutionary event where the fascists seize power. But it's more of a power-broking discussion behind closed doors where the leading politicians of Italy tries to accommodate the rising fascist movement and to use their popularity and muscle and ability to fight the communist movement of Italy for their own political gains. So it is styled as a revolutionary event, but it's not really that. But it has a quite profound impression on other people outside of Italy, including the Nazi movement in Germany.
Mm. And let's talk about how the popularity of Hitler from 1920 to 1924 that made 1923 that made him think that he is, now I'm finally able to do a putsch, a coup d'etat on the German government. How popular was he at this point in time?
Which point in time are we talking about now?
From 1920 to 1923.
Yeah, Hitler is not really that well known outside of Bavaria in the early 1920s. He figures sometimes in national newspapers or Berlin-based newspapers because they write about the right-wing scene in Bavaria or in Munich. There are, of course, huge concerns among liberal Germans and democratic Germans about the kind of threat that this poses to the new republic. And he's then mentioned as one of many that try to score political points on fighting against the Republic and against the the Versailles Treaty, and then particularly the repayment system that was forced upon Germany. So he's not very popular in Germany as a whole. He has some kind of role to play in Bavaria. He's well known in Munich and in some of the close cities around Munich, like Nuremberg or Ingolstadt. That also the main speakers of the Nazi Party in Munich travel to other cities to give speeches, but he's not really a national figure at the time. What brings him to attention is the putsch attempt or the coup attempt of November 1923. And this is very much inspired by the Mussolini's
Yeah.
so-called March on Rome, that they're trying to seize power through a revolutionary movement.
So let's talk about how the putsch occurred and of course why it failed as well because I believe it was in Munich it happened if I remember correctly. So let's talk about the barrel push and how this would become. Did this boost his popularity in a way even if it's failed?
Among some circles, yes. In general of the population, absolutely not. But again, we have to remember that Bavaria, as a region, one of the federal states of Germany, is run by a government that is opposed to the Weimar democracy. They want to turn Germany away from democracy. The leading politicians in Bavaria at the time are extremely opposed to Berlin as the capital, as they always are in Germany. Of course, the Bavarians are opposed to the Prussians, but there is a strong attempt to turn Bavaria into something that is quite different from the democratic parts of Germany. So it's they view it as some kind of a where the anti-democratic, anti-republican revolution against the Democratic Republic should start. So when Hitler and others plan this coup, Hitler is one of the minor players. It's the leading politicians, the president, you could say, of Bavaria, Ernst von Kahr. He wants to lead a revolutionary attempt to seize power away from Berlin and turn Bavaria into an autocracy. So in this, you could say, contra-democratic movement, Hitler and the Nazis are a minor player. And moving up to November 1923, during the autumn of 23, all these major players they step aside because they think that going against the federal power of Berlin is that will never work. So they move away from their plans to stage a coup. And one of the very few that remains wedded to the idea that it is possible to seize power is Hitler. And by this point, it's of course totally unrealistic because he has not that much of support either in Bavaria or other places. He's totally dependent on doing this together with other people. But they say, okay, we don't want to do this. It's too risky. It's too large margin for error. This might fail, and then it will all be over. Hitler is one of the few that say that, okay, I want to try still. And that's what they do in November 1923. They try to seize power, first in Munich by occupying some police stations, some public buildings, and marching through the streets of Munich. And this is an operation that has extremely low chance of success, to say it quite
Does he
mildly.
know
There
this,
is
or does he just say, fuck it, let's do it anyway?
he if he would think about this in realistic terms, he would of course realize that this would never work. They have some friends, a small Nazi group in Berlin. They are maybe 5, 6, 10 people that are waiting in Berlin for orders from Munich. When the revolution has succeeded in Munich, they are supposed to strike in Berlin. Now, this is a city with 3 million people. And they think that they can seize the power in the city with a handful of people. It's totally bonkers. It's totally ridiculous. But here we see one of the personal traits of Adolf Hitler very, very clearly. He is what we could call a gambler. And we see it in many important parts of his political career before the introduction of the Nazi regime in 1933, also later during the war, he gambles. He places everything on one card and hopes that it will succeed. And if the will is strong enough, if the wish that it should succeed is strong enough, it will. Just the sheer power of will force this through. Of course, this doesn't happen. In November 1923, the coup is stopped by the Bavarian police. Hitler is nearly killed. He flees and is later imprisoned and put on trial. But we see here something that Hitler would continuously do, place everything on one card at a crucial decision point, and too often, sadly for us, we could say, Hitler gambles on the right card.
Hmm.
But on this actual occasion, he doesn't. But the consequences for being wrong are not as severe as they probably should have been.
Hmm. Now, he, fascinating thing is when he was on trial, he actually managed to charm the jury quite well, so we got a minimal sentence in prison sentence, and he didn't even serve that full term. And so we have talked about this trial as well, because this, of course, will be kind of crucial for the years after him coming and leaving jail as well, because he would the Nazi Party would be banned from public political or from doing public political parties, and no, I don't remember the word right now, but they would be banned from being public, and of course, as we know, that it wouldn't stop Hitler. But let's talk about the repercussions of the trial and Hitler in jail.
Yes. You mentioned that he charmed the jury or the judges at his trial in order to give him a lenient sentence, and unfortunately, he that was not the case. You could say that maybe that had been better. He did not have to charm them because they agreed with him. And
Mm,
again, we are in Bavaria, where the judicial system, the judge that is sentencing him, becomes the first minister of justice in Nazi Germany. So he
mm,
agrees with Hitler. So he doesn't have to charm or to actually discuss with them. They are totally in agreement with him and his cause, and that is one of the breaking points, of course, in modern history. Hitler is charged by high treason because he has tried through the use of violent force to overthrow the republic. He should have been trialed in the Reichsgericht in Leipzig, which is the major courts in Germany, and if he had done so, he would probably have been sentenced to death or at least lifetime imprisonment, because that is the sentence that he was facing. But since he's brought to justice in Bavaria, and it's Bavarian authorities that make this happen because they want to trial him here because then he will have a lenient sentence because everybody in the bureaucracy or at least quite a few agree with his views. So they give him a very lenient sentence, and he's allowed to use the trial as well, like a podium to express his ideas. But again, these are not ideas that are only his. They are very, you could say, supported in large part of the Bavarian population, but also then, of course, people in important positions like judges or in the bureaucracy. So Hitler spends about 1 year in prison, and this is also again a period in his life that is shrouded in myth and legend.
mm,
It's very often repeated that he uses the time here to write or at least dictate his book Mein Kampf to his secretary Rudolf Hess, and it's a very vivid image. We can easily see Hitler pacing back and forth in his prison cell, and Hess trying to keep up with his ramblings on his small Remington typewriter in the candlelight or something. But this is again something that has emerged as a legend.
mm,
Hitler spends a lot of time in prison doing political work. He is allowed to receive guests, and he's then, of course, imprisoned together with other Nazi activists, so they are allowed to remain in some kind of political activism when imprisoned for high
mm.
treason. So this
They,
again
they kind of
tells
live
you a
a
lot
mafia
about.
style.
Sorry?
They kind of live a mafia style prison
Yes,
sentence over there.
but they are allowed to do so because the judicial system of Bavaria is more or less in agreement with their political views.
Yeah.
So they are giving them very lenient terms. They are, of course, staying in prison, but they can remain political, anti-republican, anti-democratic activists within the prison itself.
Mm. Now, I'd rather ask because in John Toland's biography that came out early 70s, I think, he claims that of course, Hitler was ridiculed in both international media and local papers, and it was so humiliating for him that he contemplated suicide, but he was unfortunately, talked out of it. Is the truth to this that did think about going through with suicide while in prison because of political humiliation?
I don't know for sure. I think there is no reason to actually believe that he contemplated suicide at this point. He was he fled the scene from Munich in November 1923 and stayed at some friends outside Munich. And when he was imprisoned, he was, of course, scared of what would be the consequences, but he knew that he had friends in very strong and influential positions within Bavarian authorities. The very same people that had planned the coup together with Hitler were now going to sentence him. So he was probably feeling quite sure that if there were a verdict, it would be quite lenient. I'm not sure where Tolan has his sources from, but you could say Hitler is a quite dramatic person. He could maybe say things that he didn't actually mean. I think we should be careful about
Yeah.
exploring this suicide possibility. The real turning point here is that Hitler escapes from the coup itself without physical damage. He could have been easily killed. The person next to him was shot. And it is precisely the judicial, you could say, response to this high treason case that is the important point here, and where history could have taken a different course.
Hmm. So let's talk about, I try to keep this schedule here. We are running a little tight, but let's talk about Hitler is from going out of jail. And of course, like I said, the political Nazi party would be banned from the political orders. But let's talk about how they still managed to be politicals, even though the ban was still in place. That wouldn't be lifted until 1927. But here I also want to bring up the rise of the SA, and I mentioned Rome earlier. And I think this is because SA doesn't really become relevant until after the 1925. So let's talk about the rise of the SA and how they were able to still be be the polit not do political stuff, even though the ban was still in place.
Yes. When Hitler is imprisoned after, and of course also others, the Nazi Party is banned. It's a nationwide ban, and it is lifted not at the same time. In Bavaria, it is lifted in 1925. And so Hitler is released from prison in December 1924, and he is able then to re-establish the Nazi Party in February of 1925. So then but in other German states, the NSDAP is still banned, or representatives of the NSDAP or the Nazi Party are banned from appearing in public. So Hitler, for instance, is not allowed to speak in the state of Prussia for still a few years after 1925. But you could say that 1925 is the reestablishment of the Nazi Party, and it's also when they change, you could say, their strategy in order to achieve political power. Because the strategy that seemed to work in Italy, like seizing power from the streets by violent action, failed spectacularly in Germany. So there's a need to try to do something else. And you mentioned the importance of the SA, the Sturmabteilungen, the brown shirts, the paramilitary part of the Nazi Party. And you're quite right in doing so, because they become much more important after 1925, but also because their role is somewhat changed. In the earliest years of the Nazi movement, the SA is more or less used as violent thugs that beats up political opponents, and also acts, of course, like security guards at the political rallies of the NSDAP. And they remain in this role, you could say. They are still used as violent thugs also from 1925, but their role is partially changed in that they are to become party activists beyond just fighting itself. So they are, you could say, the foot soldiers of the new Nazi movement that is established in 1925, which is quite different from the one we saw prior to the 1923 putsch. And they tried to establish themselves more or less like an ordinary political party that has organizations, institutions for different social groups. There is an organization for women, for young people, for students,
This is where
for
we see the
farm.
rise of Hitler-Jugend, for example. That
Yes. So the for factory workers, for farmers, so they try to appeal then to more specific social groups than they did before.
mm,
And we also see then that the Nazi movement is spreading to other parts of Germany. And now we are reaching a crucial point in the development of the Nazi movement as well, because this, you could say, establishment of the Nazi movement in other parts of Germany, then Hitler is not the driving force behind it. There's other persons that do so and then create power structures in their regions. Like you say, you have a Nazi movement in Hamburg, or you have it in Bremen, you have one in Schleswig-Holstein, you have it all over Germany that are more or
mm,
less tightly connected to the party headquarters in Munich, but also have very strong influence in their own regions. And this is one of the strong points of the Nazi movement. We often think of it as a very monolithic political organization governed from the top, but it's very you could say not very centralized. It's actually quite decentralized. And the Nazi movement in the industrial regions of the Ruhr or in the major cities like Berlin, it's quite different from the one that has emerged in Bavaria. They talk about different things. They agree on the most parts, but they also disagree strongly on other parts, and that makes their political message to their local constituencies is quite different and tailored to who they are speaking to. And this
mm,
is a very strong part of the Nazi movement, which is quite different from the others.
mm. Now, it's interesting to also note that most people who join the SA are actually are that become the SA thugs are actually unemployed. A lot of the people that they don't have anything better to do, so they join the SA as kind of feeling kind of like just one comparison to the ICE, that in the US today that they join because they are kind of unemployed and don't have anything and share the racist ideologies of the so no and I think it's also important to point out this that most people who in fact joined the SA were unemployed.
Yeah, again, we have to separate different periods, you could say,
Yeah.
because the rise of the mass unemployment appears after the stock market crash in 1929, and we see tendencies to unemployed people joining the SA, but this is not a major reason why they are able to recruit people into this paramilitary organization. What we have to remember is that the Nazi movement is a self-financed organization. It doesn't receive huge financial contributions from private funds. There are some, like I mentioned earlier, but in general, the Nazi movement is a self-financing organization. It finances itself by people paying their party dues, joining a meeting and paying the entrance fee, and every single member of the SA has to pay for his own uniform. You are not given a uniform when you join the SA. You have to buy it yourself. So to be unemployed and to be an active member of the SA, that's quite difficult
Yeah.
because you do not have the financial means to do so. And again, we are touching upon this legendary myth making that is so prevalent when it comes to the rise of the Nazi movement. There's no empirical evidence that unemployed German males flocked to the Nazi movement,
Fascinating.
either nor as voters nor as members. What we know from the period when there is a mass unemployment, those that are unemployed, they tend not to be politically active. They do not, in general, vote in election. But if they do, the majority of them vote for the Communist Party. And if they join a political organization, they join the Communist Party. So the rate of unemployed members of the SA or the NSDAP is not very, very high. It's quite low. But this is also something that is an interpretation that has been repeated so many times
Yeah.
that it has become some kind of a truth. But the empirical evidence from the period does not support this theory. But of course, there were unemployed members of the SA. But you have to remember that you had to invest quite a lot of money in this,
Mm.
and the social benefits in Germany at the time were not sufficient in order to do so.
Mm. Now, this is where I want to talk about you mentioned that in Bavaria it was the Nazi Party were legalized in 25, but I want to talk about the legalization of the Nazi Party again, and of course this would be crucial because Hitler would revolutionize the way that he did political campaigns. So let's talk about how the legalization of the Nazi Party meant that Hitler could travel nationwide for campaign, and how airplanes of at the time weren't really used by politicians. He traveled extensively to, you know, different cities, all parts of Germany. So let's talk about how, now this he would actually revolutionized political campaigning in Germany.
Yes, absolutely. And this took place in 1932 during the presidential elections of the spring of 1932.
I'm sorry if I
If
was
we
jumping ahead there.
Yeah, because so if we look back on the time where the
Yeah,
Nazi movement spreads to the whole of Germany in the mid 1920s, they are nowhere near the financial means to do so.
yeah,
So they are campaigning in more or less the same ways as other people. The difference is Hitler has a car that he is driven around around Munich and in Bavaria. But apart from that, any Nazi representative has to travel by train. And one of the major reasons why they want to have people elected to the National Assembly in Berlin, like the Reichstag, or the local Landtag elections in the German states, is that you get a free railway ticket. So you could travel around for free, because this is a major drain on the party coffers sending speakers around. What constitutes the spread of the Nazi movement to the whole of Germany is that local representatives in other parts that are more or less independent of Hitler and the Munich office start campaigning in their regional areas. And they do so then by appealing to what is important to the people that are in this constituency.
mm,
And the first part of Germany where we can see some kind of support of the Nazi movement is in the northern parts of the country. The parts today that are today Schleswig-Holstein, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, like also the Baltic Sea coast, where there is a Protestant population, mostly of farmers, that has been in a economic crisis, German farming, since the end of the First World War. And it is among these subcultures that the Nazis are able to make the first inroads when it comes to support in local elections. And they do this quite deliberately because they establish a agricultural department of the NSDAP, and they try to organize mass meetings, activities. They ship or send a lot of SA units that march around the small villages and towns of northern Germany, creating the atmosphere of a ferocious political activism for a very short time before moving to the next city and then moving to the next town. So they try to create an image of being everywhere, but
mm,
of course they are not. We have this saying in Norway that you are surely familiar with, but not maybe all your
mm,
listeners, of Tordenskjolds soldater,
yeah,
the soldiers of Thunder Shield, that he tries to appear much more numerous than he actually is by moving his soldiers around. And that's exactly the same thing as the Nazi movement do. They try to create the image of we are everywhere, we are active everywhere, but they are in general then able to pinpoint activism at different places at the same time. So the major explanation why the Nazi movement is able to gather support is that they speak to their local constituencies in a language that they can understand, addressing issues that are important to them. And the first subculture, you could say, or first element of the German society that gives some support to the Nazi movement are the small farmers of northern Germany.
Mm. I want to talk about some of the political campaigning that they do, and of course some topics of the political campaign, because anti-Semitism, of course, plays a big part of this. So let's talk about the political agendas of the Nazi Party, and of course, how big part was the anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish role? How large part did this play in the popularity of the Nazi Party at this point in time?
That's a very good question. And it is difficult to answer, of course, because we know much less about why people voted for different parties in, let's say, 1925 than we do in 2025 or 2026. We there are this system of polls or asking people about their opinions are much less developed 100 years ago. So we know less why people voted for specific parties. But the evidence that we have points towards the direction that the main contributing factor for people just joining the NSDAP as members was the sense of nationalism, the sense of being united, and finding a party that very strongly fought for German interests for German people, you could say quite bluntly. It is Ian Kershaw and also others like Oded Heilbronner has argued that anti-Semitism plays a minor part in why Germans joined the NSDAP or why they voted for the NSDAP. But of course, we can't know for sure.
Mm.
But it is probably not the major reason why people turn to the NSDAP. They are not the only anti-Semitic party, of course. So it is probably the idea of a national union, more unity among the German population that is most significant for people deciding to vote for the NSDAP. And
No,
yes, this is an important part of the ideological, you could say, idea that the Nazis tried to propagate during the 1920s and, of course, into the 1930s, this idea of the Volksgemeinschaft, the national community, that every German has a role to play, every German is significant, important, we should do away with class or boundaries or regional boundaries, everybody should work together for the common good. And this is, of course, a very exclusionary ideological idea because it excludes, for instance, the Jewish population of Germany and also others. But it's also quite popular in bringing support for the Nazi movement.
no, I think, and I might be wrong in this, but I do actually think Hitler did have some Jewish, ironically, have some Jewish supporters as well. Not maybe, obviously not because of anti-Semitism, but they felt that he didn't want any new Jews. The Jews who supported Hitler didn't want any new Jews into Germany to, be a competition for them. So ironically, it's kind of like they shot himself in the foot there, but it's interesting that there actually were some problem among the upper classes, I reckon, that that actually supported because they didn't want any new Jews in Germany either.
No, you're quite right. There are Jewish people that support Hitler. And support the Nazi movement. You could Google today. You will find images of people standing or Jewish people from Jewish organizations standing beneath a swastika flag and holding a public speech for Adolf Hitler. They were banned
It was
from
kind
doing
of
so.
it was kind of like the Latinos for Trump movement that kind of
Yeah.
backfired.
Yes, and this goes back to my previous point, is that for the idea of nationalism is probably the main reason why people support the Nazi movement. or at least the main ideological reason why they support the Nazi movement, and that the Jewish people of Germany are a very tiny minority. Many of them see themselves as Germans more than Jewish people. Many of them does not practice Jewish faith. They might baptize the children. They may marry a Christian person. So they view themselves as Germans. Some of them are not really seeing themselves as very, very Jewish, or at least not practicing religious Jews. So many of them are nationalists. They had brothers, fathers, sons that died in the war. So they view themselves as, I am a German nationalist. And then some of them look at the Nazi movement and see, okay, this is the main propagator of German nationalism now. I will support them. And this is, I think, a crucial aspect of the rights of Nazism is that it could appear as many different things at the same time. To a small-time farmer in northern Germany, they could appear as a organization that would do away with uh, um, laws that limited what do you call it? The tolls on imported products to Germany, for instance. They wanted the tolls to be as high as possible to protect the German farmers. If you were a steel worker in the Düsseldorf, in the Ruhr area, you could see the Nazi movement as a partially anti-capitalist and revolutionary movement, because they also had a very quite significant revolutionary anti-capitalist fraction. You mentioned Goebbels earlier, that he flirted with communism in his earlier years. And of course, there were people in the Nazi movement in the 1920s and 30s that were moving back and forth from communism and Nazism. And to a shopkeeper in South German town, they could see the Nazi movement as an guarantor of order, stability, and peace. And an anti-Semite could see them as anti-Semites, and a nationally oriented Jew could see them as nationalists. So you could look at Hitler and the Nazi movement and see what you wanted to see. You could find elements that you could agree on, and then you could then not look too closely on the elements that you disagreed on. And this is the very makes it possible for the Nazi movement to gather support from many different parts of German society.
Mm. Now, one crucial factor that arguably I would say played a more part in the anti-Semitism of Hitler is, of course, the anti-communism part, because Hitler made it seem like, there was either communism or fascism. That was a choice. Of course, again, we discussed this with Sir Richard J. Evans earlier, a few years ago, but that's, of course, not true. There were other options as well, but what the Nazi parties were so good at doing is that they portrayed it as it was fascism versus communism and of course, and because of this, they had a lot of support from the Catholic Church as well, because they viewed communism as a godless, ideology, and so, anti-communism argument played a large part in Germany. And gonna go on the limb and say it was probably a lot of it had to do with the barbarian communist putsch in 1919 that had a big role to play there. I think that's because of the anti-communism. But communism is arguably a big part of Hitler's political agenda as well.
Yes, you're quite right. It's a very important factor in explaining why, at least after some time, there are quite a strong support for the NSDAP. Of course, in the first elections, the national elections that the Nazi Party take place, they have almost no support. So it takes some time before they actually start to gather some momentum. But in mobilizing support within, you could say, the radical right or the extreme right of the German society, anti-communism is important, but it's also important in bringing voters and supporters to the Nazi movement. They appear as, and they also are, one of the most clearly anti-communist political players, you could say, in the Weimar Republic. And there is fear of communism within the German population. It has to do, of course, there has been several communist attempts to seize power. You mentioned the most famous one, but as we have briefly touched upon, there was also one in Bavaria
Yeah, that's the one I
in
mentioned. Yeah.
in 1918, and there were several others during the 1920s in central Germany. So this threat was real. It was, of course, not as huge as the Nazis painted it out to be, but it is an important mobilizing factor. Absolutely.
Mm. Now, now we don't have to round up soon. So let's start. I started to mention earlier about the fact that Hitler used air. How did you mentioned the financial drain on the political party? So when does Hitler actually, when is he able to use airplanes and travel extensively across the country to gain popularity in by by financial fortunes and so let's talk about both how is he able to afford this eventually, and what how the impact, how we would revolutionize the political campaigning for
Mm.
kind of being an inventor of this form of political campaigning because it has been
Yes.
done
So,
before.
yeah, so you could say that in the national election of 1930, there is a major breakthrough for the Nazi Party when they receive about 18% of the national vote. This is a quite an astounding moment. It's a huge support. Almost one-fifth of the electors throw the vote for the Nazi Party, but they're still quite a way far from the campaigning that you are mentioning here. And we have to remember that. The most important part, I think, of why the NSDAP or the Nazi Party are able to portray themselves as the major, you could say, opponent to the democratic system, because that's what they are trying to tell the voters of Germany, that the democratic republic is failing. It is not able to solve the problems or the issues that Germany is facing. And this is made more acute by the world depression from the late 1929 into the early 1930s, with rapidly rising unemployment. So what the Nazis are telling the constituencies and the voters is that the Democratic Republic will not be able to solve this. You have to give the power to us. We can solve it. It is only in the calamitous and very extensive political campaigning year of 1932 that the Nazi movement is able to pull together enough resources to send Hitler on an airplane campaign around Germany. This is a year when there is first in the spring a presidential election, because they are held every 7 years. And the president is, of course, then Hindenburg, one of the most conservative people in Europe at the time. So it says a lot that the democratic, liberal Weimar Republic is governed by a president that is extremely against the same democratic that he is a president for. But I mentioned earlier that Hitler is a very modern politician.
Yeah.
He's very concerned of how he appears. And this is one of the reasons why he's so closely keeping a lid on his personal history, on his background. Um, Hitler is short-sighted. He is dependent on glasses, and he uses glasses all the time. But can you remember seeing a photograph of Hitler wearing
No.
glasses? There are extremely few, because he is always posing when he is photographed. There are very, very, very few photos of Hitler that he is not aware that he's taking, that he's been photographed. So he's always posing. He's never relaxed, you could say. He's always very concerned about his image. So they partially revolutionized, you could say, political campaigning in 1932 by sending Hitler on an airplane campaign. That's the first time this has been done. And this is the reason why they do this is because one of the major tools they have, you could say, in their political toolbox is Hitler as a public speaker. So they try to send him around to hold or to speak at political rallies in many cities at the same day. And they are able to do so for a limited time. It gets a lot of press coverage. It's in the newspapers. They have journalists flying with him in this plane. They call the campaign Hitler über Deutschland, Hitler over Germany, or Hitler like overseeing Germany, and they try to then to portray himself or to portray Hitler as the coming leader of Germany. Of course, he fails in the presidential election. He only becomes the run-up to Hindenburg, and they try to repeat this during the campaigns to the national election during the summer of 1932.
And what I want to mention as well, and I don't know how relevant this is right now, I think it is, but yeah, according to historian Joachim Fest, there are a lot of those who contribute, businesses who contributed to Hitler campaign also actually went bankrupt because of their contribution. A lot of them went bankrupt because their support of Hitler that, it it didn't end well for many of the businesses. That I don't know how true this is, but I think but from when I read Joachim Fest mentioned that a lot of businesses actually went bankrupt in supporting the Nazi Party.
Yes, this is also an important element, you could say, to the rise of the Nazi movement. In what sense were they financially supported by business or business entrepreneurs in Germany? In the Marxist historical view, of course, the interpretation of the rise of the Nazi movements is that it is a tool of the appropriated classes like big business. They use the fascist movement, the Nazi movement, to control the working class, the left-wing parties, the trade unions, and they give them huge contributions financially in order to be able to keep their political mobilization going. Um, there is, of course, elements they wouldn't have been able to orchestrate this airplane campaign without contributions from businesses. And just to rent a plane like that for several days is extremely expensive,
Yeah,
of course. In general, the evidence points towards that the Nazi movement is a self-financing organization. It is not to a large extent supported by German businesses, so we cannot really say that they are propped up or financed by German industry in order to use them as a political tool. Most German business owners are skeptical towards the Nazi movement. They think they have some very good ideas. They want to move away from the very democratic republic that has introduced quite liberal laws for employment and 8-hour working day and so they want to reduce the workers' rights, many of these business owners, and they think that they can use the Nazis to do so. But they're also quite skeptical because the Nazis are also quite anti-capitalists, particularly in some areas of Germany. They are violent. They cause uprisings in the streets. They have demonstration marches. So they are also a threat to law and order. And this is something that the business owners don't like at all. So they are reluctant to give huge sums of money to Hitler and the Nazis. They do so, but only after Hitler became Chancellor in 1933.
Mm. So let's talk about how he managed to become chancellor, because like you said, and as we discussed before, Hitler, I don't know if you mentioned this actually, but Hitler only wanted to be chancellor, and nothing second best was never good enough for him. So how does he end up in parliament? I'm kind of rushing this a little bit because I know you have to go soon, so I don't want to keep you over time, but. Let's talk about how Hitler actually gained power and actually managed to fool Hindenburg into making him chancellor.
Yes, this is a complicated issue, of course, but you could say that the rise of the support for the Nazi Party is gradually, both in national elections and also in regional elections throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s. The economic crisis, the world depression that hits Germany very hard in the early 1930s is important to understand this. And this doesn't mean that people in Germany rushed to the Nazis in because they were afraid of the consequences of the depression. But the depression was the indirect cause of a political crisis in Germany in March 1930 when the Social Democratic government resigned. It was a Social Democratic government in Germany up till March 1930, and they resigned, and there were new elections in September of 1930. And from that point onwards, the governments of Germany were not supported by the national parliament. The subsequent governments, being from Brüning or Papen or Schleicher or who else was the prime minister or the chancellor, did not have a support in the National Assembly. So you could say that from at least from the spring of 1930, the German democracy ceased to function, and the power was placed um, increasingly in the circles surrounding the president Hindenburg. And he was an old man, he was almost 100 years old. He was not very interested in politics, and he spent some time in Berlin, of course, because he had to, but he liked to return to his estates in Prussia. And he was then very much influenced by people close to him. That was his son, and there were also people more like him, like army officers and people from the land-owning aristocracy in North and Eastern Germany. And in order to understand that the Nazis were able to reach power, we have to look at this. Because there was, of course, a rising support at the polls for the NSDAP. They reached a couple of like 32, 33% in the summer of 1932, but they're still very far from the majority. And this is what the Nazis insist on. They will only be a part of a national government, or especially Hitler does so, if they can rule alone, and if he can have majority power in the parliament. And they are always far away from actually obtaining this. And during the autumn of 1932, the political mobilization of the Nazi movement is obviously waning. They are running out of cash, and there are disagreements within the Nazi movement on what should be the next step. Should they accept the invitations to be part of a minority government governing with other parties like the Catholic Center Party, or should they try to gain power through elections alone? There is a huge, like you say, a power struggle within the Nazi movement. And as the autumn turns into winter of 1932, 1933, it is fairly obvious to everyone that the political mobilization, you could say the political power of the Nazi movement is rapidly waning. And then these people around Hindenburg, the traditional elites around Hitler, from the army, from the big business, they think that we can now use Hitler. We can invite him in to the political scene in which he is not able to force himself, because he's trying to use the elections to force himself and the Nazi movement into political power. He's not able to do so. So they think that, okay, now he is waning. Now is the time to bring him in. Now is the time to bring the Nazis into power, because we can use their political mobilization for our own gain until they disappear from the political stage, maybe in 2, 3, 4 years. So that's the calculation. They don't want to rule together with Hitler, but they think they can use him for a few short years to gather support for their own, you could say, anti-democratic
How
agenda.
wrong
Like
they were. How wrong they were.
they were wrong, but you can also understand why they did this kind of
Yeah.
calculation. They were, of course, thinking that are we doing a mistake by inviting these radical anti-Semitic thugs into politics, but they were also thinking that if we move them into political power, they will also cool down. They will have to be more moderate. But of course, the exact opposite actually happened. But we often talk about this situation like the Nazis just rose and rose and became more and more powerful and just had they were able to force themselves, you could say, into political
Yeah.
power. They were far away from that. They were aided into political power by anti-democratic, anti-republican elites that wanted to destroy the Weimar Republic and turn it back into more like a military dictatorship that was before the First World War.
Mm. What is interesting to note also is that while the Germans were elected into office, it was not by it was by violent means. It was the SA thugs that were outside the election polls almost beating people up if they didn't vote for. So while yes, they were elected into political power, they were also using violent means to being elected into power.
Absolutely, and you could say that they used violence to create that position they were in the autumn of 1932. They would not have been able to have this kind of support or this presence without the use of violence. And this violence is, of course, physical in the sense that the Nazis are a major contributor to the political violence of the Weimar Republic, beating up political opponents, murdering political opponents. But this violence is also symbolic, like marching in streets, occupying, you could say, the major squares of a small town or a large city for an extensive period of time, and to have this presence, you could say, in the public sphere. So they use violence both in the direct and in the indirect way. But there's little evidence to suggest that the Nazis would, on their own, been able to force themselves into power. And also the traditional reactionary elites of Germany that actually gave them power or invited them in were not interested in working with them for a long time. They only wanted to use them for the limited time period that they actually thought they were able to mobilize voters. So this is a complicated issue. Sometimes we portray it a bit simplistic, like saying that the Nazis were elected to power. In some sense, they were, but in other important senses, they were not.
Yeah.
And it is important to undermine that Weimar democracy, the German democracy, had not been working for almost 3 years when Hitler became Chancellor. The Nazis didn't destroy the German democracy on their own. There were many others that wanted to, you could say, turn the clocks back to the good old days before the war when Germany was the major power of Europe, and they were then trying to use the Nazis for this purpose.
Mm. Now, my final question before we end this conversation of part one is what would have happened had Hitler not gained political power? What do you think a Germany would look like? And what do you think would be the consequences of, or not consequences, but what would the result of Hitler not gaining political power?
This is a very good question. And of course, we have a tendency sometimes also when we read a history book about this that to it almost appears inevitable
Yeah.
that the Nazis would gain power. Of course, it was never inevitable. There were other courses that could have been taken here. Other decisions could have been made. If we say that, if you take the most simple one, let's say that the circles around Franz von Papen, who is the major player that brings Hitler to power in 1933, let's say they decide to do something else. Let's say they tried to still keep the Nazis away from power also in the early 1933. They continued to govern in a nationalist, anti-republican government that has little support, but they still keep the Nazis away from power. The German economy was then on becoming increasingly good. The unemployment was had begun to go not go away, but at least to be reduced, because also the economic global context was improving for Germany's part. So this important part of bringing the Nazis to the brink of political power, the economic crisis, the unemployment, was beginning to improve. So, if Hitler was
Just
not
a brief.
invited to, yes,
Sorry for
so if
interrupting, but I just want to bring up few brief things as well. The economic crash in 1929, of course, was a major factor to Hitler gaining power as well. Just one of the major factors that caused the rise of Nazi Germany.
yes, of course, but it's also how the political establishment of Germany tried to, or not tried to, actually alleviate the economic depression, but tried to use it as a way of removing the repayment system
Yeah,
on Germany. So yes, so but it's what would be the consequence for the Nazi movement if they were not invited into power in January 1933 when they were? They would probably continue to whittle away and maybe fragment into different and also warring parts. That is my suggestion. That is my guess, and that's also what other historians have suggested. There
mm,
was nothing inevitable about this. We would probably have seen Germany moving towards a military dictatorship in during the 1930s with fascist-like ideology, perhaps focusing on German nationalism, German irredentism, and the attempt to remove the Versailles Treaty, maybe try to integrate German minorities outside of Germany, like in Austria or in other parts of Germany, but not with the same vigor or extremity as the Nazis did when they came to power. So we would have seen a right-wing Germany. We would have seen a Germany, I think, governed by the elites in the military and the landowning class and in big business. But we would not have seen a totalitarian dictatorship that unleashed a war
mm.
on the entire European continent.
And I'm sure you've seen the interview. I just kind of had to feel like I had to mention this in either with the German AFD, with Elon Musk had a few years ago with the leader of AFD, Alice Weidel. She thinks that he said that Hitler was a communist, but of course that's ludicrous. But again, we made an episode with Roger Griffin a few years back as well, where we discussed that actually early historians kind of drew a similarity between fascism and communism. So that may, again, she of course is ludicrous to think that Hitler was a communist. And, you can see both similarities and dissimilarities between fascism and communism.
Yes, of course there are some similarities, but I think that's the trend that we have seen not only in the last few years, but since the 1920s to portray the Nazis as left wing or communist.
Yeah,
That is something that has been done on the extreme right wing in many countries. Then they have pointed to the strong government policies,
yeah,
for instance, but there is no real reason to argue that the Nazis were a socialist or a communist
yeah,
movement. Some people have made a point that they call themselves a National Socialist German Workers' Party, so they have to be socialist, but they have a totally different understanding of what socialist means than what a
yeah,
Marxist socialist would actually think. So it's
yeah.
of course, there are similarities between totalitarian movements and ideologies, but there is no reason to call them left wing or
Yeah.
communist. No.
I think we're gonna round it up there, and I know we're a little bit on overtime, but thank you again so much for taking a part of this. We will be back for part two next week. We will take a look at the Third Reich in power. Thank you again so much for doing this. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you today. And of course, if the book is not available in English as yet, as far as I know, but hopefully there will be a translation in the future of the book. So so international readers can also enjoy the book. And but for those few, actually, ironically, minority of my listeners are Norwegian. But if there are a few Norwegians who are listening to this podcast, where can they find the book, The Tredje Reich, of course? And if the people have further questions about the Third Reich, where can they find you? If they're on social media, are you on social media or anywhere else where they can ask you questions? And again, thank you for coming. It's been a great pleasure to have you on.
Thank you.
Do you have anything else you want to share? Anything links you want me to put in the description or anything you want to promote right now before you go?
No, not really. I'm not a huge participant on social media. Those that would like to ask me a question, sure, you'll find my email address. It's on my Oslo Metropolitan University profile page. You can find it there. I'm happy to answer your questions if you have anything concerning the rise of the Nazi movement or anything else.
Thank you again so much for coming in. It's been a great pleasure to have you on. And this has been Without H12. We are available on social media under Instagram, Twitter. I still call it Twitter. I refuse to call it whatever Elon calling it these days. And of course, I mean, under Without H12, both social media. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. Under Without H12. And of course, if you are on Spotify, leave us 5 stars. And if you're on YouTube, leave a comment and share the episode as well on every platform. On Apple Podcasts, leave a review. You can also leave a comment under Spotify these days. And this has been With That Aged Well. My name's Alan, and I'll see you next time.